Buenas noches. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another time together in Tertuliando en Cuarentena. This is space that we have, and we have today our good friend Jay Bakker, my good friend Jay Bakker, and let me bring him over so then he can talk for himself. Amigo, how's it going?
Good. I've got all sorts of weird sun because I have my window open. Hope that's okay.
That's beautiful nature. Let's let nature in.
Yeah.
Hopefully that'll guide us through this dialogue and this conversation. For those of you who have never come through and have never joined and tuned in, Tertuliando en Cuarentena, for all you English speakers, it might sound like a bit of a gibberish, but it's actually three Spanish words that basically are conveying this intentional space that I'm opening to welcome guests, friends, and have intentional dialogue, and not just dialogue, but this whole back and forth mutuality of learning from one another and perhaps unlearning. About some days ago, Jay was here. I guess I was like the introductory episode to welcome you in, and today we're gonna dive in more into a more specific topic, and that is in the nature of what your pilgrimage has been like as far as like your evolution of your philosophy, your theology, and your spirituality. But before anything, I want to kind of catch up with you and see how everything is going on through this whole dynamic as we're still things are changing. It's continually changing, and for the better and for the worse, both
Yeah.
ends. So how have you been doing? Since we last spoke.
It's been a tough couple of weeks. Just lots of stuff going on personally, and just trying to kind of move through it. And had some family issues come up. Not much I can really talk about right now, but just trying to deal with life on life's terms, at the same time being stuck in inside. And also parenting. So trying to get my kids out in ball fields and things like that when we can. So it's been okay. I've been doing a lot of podcasts. A few podcasts that I've done recently just got released, and some I'm pretty proud of. So one was called, I think, Radical Love Live. I just recently did, and that was really cool. So yeah, I'm just staying busy. Did some Loosen the Bible Belt podcasts today, and obviously doing this one today. So just keeping
Good,
busy, working as much as I can, and getting the message out there.
good. Yeah, this space of having no other than to be in lockdown, can definitely be reaped into I guess attacking that internal procrastinational spirit that might inflict many of us. I'm the first one to raise my hand in there, but it's been good. At least I've been able to explore this dynamical time to venture into, like, for example, this for instance, and it's been good. It's kind of weird when I do go out. Like today, I went out for the first time, like in the car. I did like a curbside pickup, and it was a bit surreal because I literally have not gone out at all other than just around the house, around the block.
Right, right.
So to like encounter, like to see other people, I didn't even get out of my car, but to see other human beings, I know they're still existing, but to see them in person, it's kind of, and then with a mask and everything, as I also was all wearing a mask. But
Yeah.
let's dive into this. I'm really super intrigued as to hearing a little bit about your story, and if I could start things off somewhere. Why don't we start things off where you dove into this thing called ministry, and then you started along with some friends this thing called revolution.
Well, it's funny because we were talking about evolution of theology, and I even was thinking further back because recently
Oh,
I
go
saw
go for it.
I saw a video when I was born in 1975, and I think this video is from 1976. It was a PTL video, and I was being presented as a baby on my parents' television show, and all these people were praying for me, and the people who were praying for me for the future of my life and ministry, Pat Robertson,
Wow.
Paul and Jan Crouch, my parents. and a lot of other people. And I thought, isn't this weird to have like these kind of like evangelical, conservative evangelicals praying over my future?
Yeah.
And maybe
You
the
should have
rat.
like a reunion, like a get back together,
Well,
um, reunion
it's like
experience.
radical. Like it became like radical. Like their prayers for radical theology became true 44 years later.
Yeah,
Um,
pretty
but
much.
but yeah, so I grew up in the Assemblies of God, which is an evangelical denomination,
Mm,
pretty conservative. They believe in speaking in tongues and things like that. They believe in the rapture. When I was a kid, I remember being worried that if I came home and couldn't find anybody, the rapture had happened.
me too.
Um,
We
yeah,
had that
and
too.
I thought, you know, it was all based on being good. Like being a Christian was being good and doing the right thing. And so that was a big part of my life. And then also my parents were televangelists who reached out to all people and really showed me that love was always the trump card. Um, and so I was on Christian television. I was a part of the Royal Rangers, which was like a Christian Boy Scouts and things like that. And then in 1987, my parents had their scandal, and I saw the majority of these evangelical Christians, because I wasn't very involved with mainline denominations at all, but these evangelical Christians turn on my family. But at the same time this was happening and my parents were losing everything, they were still reaching out to people who were less fortunate than them, that, were hungry, that needed Christmases, that needed things like that, and making me and my sister part of it. Um, but it was really a devastating time. Um, but those little things, like spending a Christmas with this family in need, really spoke to my heart and to my soul of saying, like, there were no cameras around, there was nothing like this happening, and my parents still really cared about people, so it wasn't just entertainment or a job.
Hmm.
um a few years later my father would go to prison, and I believe it was 1989, and he served 5 years. He originally got 45 years, which was insane. But also seeing how churches reacted to that. And while my father was in prison, there were a few times where I would go to churches and try to get involved, but it was always about being good enough or having
Yeah.
my emotions worked that God loves you. You go to church camp and get all these like emotions of like, you got to be better. And because I was a young kid, but I drank a lot and I partied a lot, and so I would feel bad and then get Jesus and then be okay for a few weeks and then go back to what I was doing. Um, but there was always this weird relationship with Christianity, of that it was about good works and about what I could
Performing.
do, performing,
Mhm.
and what I could give up, what I did and what I didn't do. But it was very basic stuff like don't drink, don't smoke,
Don't masturbate.
don't
You know.
masturbate, don't have
Mm.
sex, and then you'll be okay. Um, and the reason I mention that all is because this is kind of like this little foundation of Christianity. And and it was programmed into me really early. I mean, heaven and hell and all these concepts, and Noah, and the ark, and the all that stuff. But when my dad was going through that, I still would go to go to church, and sometimes I would hear preachers use my parents as an example of things not to do and how not to be. And that was really tough. So I was really torn with this concept of what is Christianity, why are Christians so particular, why aren't they loyal, why don't
Hmm.
they forgive when they talk about forgiving. And it was really tough. And then when my father got out of prison, and that's the time that you were mentioning originally, me and my friends uh, started this thing in Arizona called Revolution Church. And the reason we started Revolution Church was it seemed like punk rock kids and skateboard kids and hippie kids were all falling through the cracks. And here I was 18, and I think Mike was 19 or 20, and we were all young. And we wanted to try to start this church where we would do concerts and do sermons, but we were still evangelicals. We still wanted to win everybody to Jesus. And so that was the main concept, except it was cool. It was like we
Yeah.
were hip Christians, we were punk rock Christians, we were, skateboarding Christians, and doing all that stuff for Jesus. But that's kind of that was the beginning of the theology of I mean, it's a simple theology, but it was the beginning of this weird simple theology, also with this tied in thing of, for my parents, of love, this constant, like, but love is always the trump card, that my
Yeah,
parents had
yeah, that
always
that was
taught
that
me.
was ingrained within you. That was. I
Yeah.
mean, whether you wanted to accept it or admit it or not, it was in your DNA because of
So,
how you grew up.
and I couldn't reject people, and a
Hmm.
lot of people were saying reject people. I felt rejected by God. I felt like I didn't belong to God, or God was disappointed in me, but I felt like I could not be disappointed in others. Um,
To put a little bit of color, a little bit, paint things a little bit more specific. When you guys are starting this, each one of you and your mates, each one of your friends are in your respective sort of congregation. Are you guys still sort of congregating, or have like that Sunday morning experience, or you're completely withdrawing from that, so then you start this thing kind of not for other people alone, but also for yourselves,
no,
or
we would go to church on Sundays
mhm.
mornings together, and then we would have our services Sunday evenings, and at this little building,
Yeah.
and we would have bands come in and play, and so we were all still having prayer meetings, praying all the time,
Did
Bible
you guys
studies.
at that point, were you guys finding anything in the content of you guys' church preaching and the church Bible studies that you found that was a bit conflictive? I'm trying to understand maybe where you guys were standing at and how you guys were looking at what your churches were doing or your churches were speaking. Was there in that commencement, in that early times, were there any things that you
Well,
guys
there were
found that
things
was
the things that were conflicting with us is that the bigger church and people in other ministries around us were saying what we were doing was wrong, or like the church's youth group was not allowed to come to Revolution
to your thing? Yeah.
because we were seen as too edgy. So there was a bit of conflict there. That was a bit strange. But yeah, so we just kind of I mean, we were evangelical Christians, and I mean, I think you saw it a lot with things like Cornerstone, which is a big Christian festival, music festival
Hmm.
in Illinois once a year. Just these punk rock. Most of the people were conservative Christians. I wasn't conservative at the time. I've always been liberal, always been a Democrat, and so I was a Democrat, which kind of made me the odd man out, because I didn't like conservatives because they always voted for people to have longer sentences, and having a dad who was in prison,
Ah, okay. It hit home with
I
you.
was yeah, I was jaded by that.
It,
So I've always been kind of pushing back a little bit on things and not taking everything at face value. But it got to the point where I was so burnt out because I thought there was something wrong with me. Like, I thought I couldn't please God. I couldn't make God happy. I mean, this just all seems so bizarre now that even where I'm at now.
but it's part of that, in that present moment. It was a very real experience.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was very real. And so I left the church. I left Revolution and moved back to Atlanta,
And
Georgia.
they're still running it. They were still running it. You very intentionally and very you communicated this to them like I cannot do this
Yeah.
right now. And what was that like? I mean, what was your argument in telling? Were you like wholly honest as to how you didn't fit in, or like did you kind of make an
Yeah,
excuse
I mean,
like
I was
withdraw?
no, I mean, I was as honest as I could be, but I was just really disillusioned, and I just said I don't feel like I can add up to what you guys want me to be. And
Hmm.
I felt like God was disappointed with me. So I just quit the ministry, moved in with a friend of mine who was a youth pastor, and his family, but we had a little downstairs apartment, and got a job and tried to live my life, and volunteer a little bit with the youth ministry there, just to kind of stay somewhat connected. Um, and I think I kind of regretted it a little bit. Um,
Like leaving Revolution, you
yeah,
mean? Yep.
leaving. Yeah, because it was edgy, it was different, it was doing something unique. Um, but at the same time, I don't know, I needed something. My dad was out of prison at the time, so but I didn't go back to him to live with him. I went to Atlanta, and lived with my friends, the Palks. And it was there that a big shift happened. And when I was talking to my friend D.E. Palk, and I told him, I said, I feel like God hates me. And no matter what I do, and I said, I can't add up. And I remember I was smoking a cigarette. I was just so done. And he said, well, Jay, he goes, you're making Christ's death in vain. And I go, what are you talking about? And he's like, you're trying to earn your salvation. It's all about what you do or you don't do. And he's like, and that's not what salvation is. And that had the biggest impact. I mean, that was the slippery slope that I needed to get to where I am today, is him revealing grace to me. And finally one day, I mean, I thought he was justifying it. And I said, prove it to me. And he got me to read Galatians, which is still my favorite book in the Bible.
Hmm.
And then he got me to read, I think, Romans and then maybe Corinthians, and I don't know, but read some of Paul's writings, which I wasn't that familiar with. And
And at that point, you had not read the like the New Testament or aspects of it.
I'd read some of the Gospels,
Hmm.
and that was it. And I think I read uh, Psalms and Proverbs. So that was really it for me.
So as soon as he mentioned it, did you become like immediately intrigued to go into it, or did you wait a bit? Did you kind of procrastinate a little bit, or
No,
did you?
I got really intrigued. I mean, I
Mhm.
was full blown alcoholic at the time. Really bad drinking problem. And that was kind of my always the thing with thinking God didn't care about me, is because I drank all the time. And I went through a therapist who said, I think you might have an alcohol problem, whatever. But this concept of grace made me realize that it didn't matter if I was
Mhm.
drunk or not drunk. So at first, I remember going out drinking and telling people about grace. That
Mhm.
I'd get drunk and then I want to tell people about grace and be like,
Of
God
course,
loves us just the way we are. It's my mind's blown,
your
and I'd have
first
to,
audience.
yeah, I'd have to share it with people at the bar, a bar that I would eventually end up having church services at the
Full circle.
Masquerade. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it was really bizarre. And so yeah, so it all just started coming together. I went, got sober, and kept reading the Bible and wanted to,
You did double A or
yeah, I did AA, and then I
yeah.
did then started going. I didn't know where to start. I didn't have any formal education. So I just started going to the family Christian bookstore and buying books about the Bible, books on Greek and Hebrew, books on historical background, books on Paul, and reading the Bible and reading these books. And then, having a Bible with commentary. I mean, I was just trying to figure it all out on my own and being self taught, which was really difficult.
Yeah.
And not a lot of people think like, oh, where did your liberal theology come from? And I'm like, yeah, Christian bookstores. Um,
Sponsored.
yeah. So I just kind of just was going on this journey, and then started getting involved with. I wanted to do revolution again. Called my friends in Arizona and said, hey
Th-
guys,
They're still there.
I'd like to start the church again in Atlanta and do a revolution in Atlanta. And I know we always wanted to branch out. So what do you think about that? And they said, yeah, we think it's a great idea. And I said, well, okay. And started it and started preaching grace. Probably, I still believed in hell. I still had all the normal evangelical thinking, except for the idea that grace now was this really amazing thing that I felt like people never heard about, people never talked about. And so that's all I wanted to preach about and talk about, was this idea of grace. And I think even originally the idea was ironically, is that I felt like I was getting revenge too on a lot of the people who didn't love my parents or restore my parents, because I was like, here it is in the Bible that we're supposed to forgive, we're supposed to give grace, we're supposed to love, and no one's done that in my life or my family's life. So what gives? Why aren't we talking about this? Why don't we talk more about this idea of grace and
Hmm.
acceptance? So yeah, so that kind of led me into doing that. And
How did you start? I mean, you're coming from starting those with your friends over there in Arizona, so now you're on your own.
yeah,
So who did you partner with? How did you begin that how did you begin to speak out this thing you wanted to do? How did you go
I
about
I,
it?
I got a job with a ministry, an inner city ministry called Safe House Outreach,
Hmm.
run by Philip Bray. in Atlanta, and I went to work for him. And originally I went to work with him and just to work with homeless folks. But then eventually I wanted to do Revolution. And he goes, well, why don't you just do Revolution here? And said, okay. And so I made flyers, passed out flyers, and started having services there.
And people started
People showed up.
curiously coming in, and you would just
Yeah.
have like a kind of like a Bible study kind of thing, or
Yeah. Yeah. It was kind of like a Bible study, and we'd all talk it out. And, there was a time where I helped. There was a big church that was trying to put together a Christian festival, the Church of God Church, and they brought me on to help with their music festival. And I was just studying and doing this, and then I started reading. I read this book. What was it called? Gosh, it's been so long. It was by a guy named Steve Brown, and it might have been called "What's So Amazing About Grace," or "If Grace Is True." Maybe if it was Grace, I can't
is not
remember.
is not Philip Yancey?
No, it's not Philip
No.
Yancey, but
Okay.
it's this guy named Steve Brown,
Hmm.
and I wish I could remember that. Oh, it was something like "When Being Good Isn't Good Enough." That was the name of
Okay.
the title. "When Being Good Isn't Good
So a
Enough."
book kind of like about grace as well.
Yeah, and so that book really floored me. Then I found out about Brennan Manning
Mm.
and read this book that he had written called The Ragamuffin Gospel.
Yeah.
And so that was another shift to even go further into grace, further into this understanding of unconditional love, pure acceptance, and that's when I first came in touch with Paul Tillich, because Manning quotes Tillich in that
Mm.
book from this sermon that Tillich did called Accepting That You're Accepted.
Yeah.
And so that was another like key to a journey that was coming down the line.
Yeah. About to
Um,
unfold.
yeah, it was about to unfold. And so I just kept studying, and I realized I kept having these butting heads with other evangelical Christians. When I started getting invited to Cornerstone Music Festival, I was butting heads with a lot of the leadership there. I was butting heads with a lot of other evangelicals there. And they kept pushing back on this message of grace. But I was blinded by it. You know what I mean? I felt
Yeah.
like I was like Martin Luther, like all of a sudden I was free from the Catholic Church, but instead it was the evangelical church or whatever. And and so I had this moment of this awakening, and I couldn't be shaken from it. Or even Paul Road to Damascus type of thing. It was just like I was free. So I just had to continue to share it, and I would share it. I mean, there were times people would want to fist fight me at some of these festivals. I mean, it was
Hmm.
really bizarre how harsh it was, this idea of grace, because they all thought it was a slippery slope. And now looking back, they were right, because it's continued to take me down this level of a different type of theology
Yeah. They
and
were right in a
philosophy.
way.
Yeah, in a way they were right.
And within their mindset, I guess.
I mean,
What were
it
some of the things? Do you remember
freed
some
me
of the
from
things?
evangelicalism.
Do you remember some of the things that they would if any of them actually argued some points? Do you remember any of the things they would say? Like
Yeah.
specifically.
Well, I mean, I remember Glenn Kaiser were telling me, like,
Mm, I
he
know
was
that
telling me
name.
like about one of his guys. He was like, oh, my so and so is really into social justice, but he's into it too much, Jay. And he's like, and I feel the same way about your message of grace, is that you've not balanced it with the law. And that's what everybody
Um,
said. You've got to balance it with the law. And I said,
hmm,
no, I'm dead to the law. And I remember one time doing a sermon at Cornerstone saying, holiness, you can't long for holiness because holiness has been bestowed upon you. You can't want to be holy because you are
you
holy,
are. Mm,
and not because of anything you've done. And I remember one of the leaders being in that talk, standing up and yelling at me and telling me that I was wrong. And so I used verses that I knew and backed it up. And then I sat and prayed, and then I continued my talk. Um, so these people were pushing back. People really thought there was this idea of grace was like everybody wanted grace light, like grace with an asterisk. And
hmm.
I just, the way I saw it, I was like, this doesn't exist. There's no asterisk when it comes to grace. And so, yeah, that was, it was pure acceptance, and people didn't like that idea. And I was just going like, it's right here in the Bible. It's what Paul is saying. when Paul is explaining what Christ accomplished through Christ's life. I mean,
Yeah.
because Paul doesn't really focus on things that Jesus did or said, but he focuses a lot on the cross and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Not a lot of historical Jesus in the writings
No.
of Paul. Um, in this whole, because I know a little bit about your story, so I want to come in and ask, where does Mike Yaconelli come in into this whole dynamic? Is it around this kind of time that
Yeah,
you're
it's
thinking
around
of?
this time. Someone gives me his book, Messy Spirituality. And it's another book that blows my mind. And he has this one chapter where he talks about balance and how balance sounds good. It's good, and it's like a yin and a yang, and good and bad, and law and grace, and all this. And then he ends it with saying, avoid balance at all cost. Like,
Hmm.
live a life of radical grace. And that floored me. And it was like someone believed what I was saying. It was like just being like, this is it. Now, at the same time, I'm doing this. I'm reading Brennan Manning. I'm reading Henry Nouwen. I'm reading a lot of these guys. And so it was like, and I read Yaconelli, and Yaconelli's family had a huge impact on me in my life and my ministry. They had me come speak at
Youth
youth
specialties.
specialties, which is like
Biggest youth workers
thousands and
thing.
thousands and thousands of youth workers. Unfortunately, when I was coming, Mike passed away right before I got there, so I didn't get to meet him ever. But I got to meet his family and his wife, and they're wonderful people. But that book changed my just it just was like I was reading the right books. I was reading, just these books about grace, and they kept coming my way, and they kept coming from a friend of mine who was evangelical youth pastor, another evangelical youth pastor, Bobby, and Bobby just kept giving me these books, and I just get more and more and more excited about this concept of grace.
Did any of those
Um,
books lead to like branch out to more particular systematic theology, or like any books that are that kind of like when you read some of Brennan Manning's, and it it got you curious about Paul Tillich, but in the Yaconelli, in the other books you've mentioned, were there any branching out to that you can directly point to that book and say, oh, then I picked up this book that is more into the like the get your hands you know your nails all dirty with theology, like getting deep into it,
yeah, well, I
or is
mean,
that later?
it comes a little bit later, but it was getting me into, like I said, I was going and buying Bible commentaries and history books on the Bible because I started to want to know the history behind some of these people's lives and what was happening at the time, and I wanted to be able to preach the Bible within its context. So I mean, I'd have Bibles and books because I didn't have a computer or anything, and so I had everything just laid out in front of me, and I would just sit and study and take notes and do all this stuff, and I was just eating it up. I mean, it was just because the more I studied, the better the news got to me. I mean, there was things that I did felt uncomfortable with in the Bible and things like that, but I was so focused on this concept of grace that I kind of kept using that lens, and I had a very strong Paulinian lens for everything I was reading, even the Gospels. And um, and then that's the time where the emergent church was coming into things, and I was automatically pulled into being a part of the emergent church. Now, I wasn't meeting with all these guys, but what was happening was that because of my message of grace and because I was questioning the norm, I was automatically just put into that category. Um,
Like, did someone communicate or sent you like a welcome to the emerging
no, but I had a I had
church?
a I had a TV special group, a group who was doing a TV special for like ABC or CBS or something like that on the emergent church, and they called me and they like, you're one of the churches that we want to
Oh,
interview,
wow.
and
Wow.
they were calling it emergent church or postmodern church.
Uh-huh.
And so I remember them sitting down and interviewing me, and they're like, "So, what does emergent church mean to you? What does being postmodern mean to you?" And I'm like, "I don't know what it means." I said, "Like, can you explain it to me? Because I'm not sure what it means. All I'm doing is preaching this message of
You
grace."
called me, so
Yeah, And so, yeah, I mean, I guess this doesn't. I thought this would sound more exciting than it was, but so I was just reading these books, studying books, reading commentaries, And
Were you already having church at a bar when they called you when you got that call from ABC, or
yeah, we had to have a yeah, we did do a couple services at a bar.
but not
Um,
Masquerade or
Not the Masquerade yet. We
okay,
did actually no. I was in a band, and they filmed me playing in my band at the Star Bar. So I wasn't
yeah.
even meeting in the bar yet, but they did have footage of me with my band because we did this Halloween concert Revolution thing that my band played at. And we were doing stuff like putting together shows with Christian bands and regular bands, and we were just doing different stuff, just always questioning and pushing boundaries. And a lot of this came from grace, but I feel like I had this very simplistic, very like, Jesus is rose and died in 3 days, heaven and hell, all this kind of stuff was still there. So it was still kind of evangelical, but it was really grace oriented. I mean, like Christianity Today come and did a big article on us. So I
Hmm.
mean, we weren't that radical. We had tattoos. That was the most radical thing, I think. And my concepts of grace maybe were radical.
When did you start shifting Revolution to a bar? Like, how did when was that first dynamic, or did you already start flirting with the idea
Well, we
for a while,
started
or
we started meeting in that we left. We started meeting in a coffee shop in Little Five Points, which is the neighborhood that we worked out of a lot. So we started meeting in a coffee shop there. Then we left Safe House and became a church of our own. And we needed a place to meet. And there was a bar called the Masquerade. And they said, "We heard you needed a place to meet. Would you like to meet at our bar?"
mhm,
And so we were like, "Yeah, sure, that'd be great." And that was so weird because I remember the first service looking out and seeing people drink beer, and you could still smoke in bars. So people were
mhm.
smoking. So sometimes I would actually have a cigar or even a cigarette during service, um, which was funny. But
I have a funny story about that, by the way. I don't know if I can interject.
yes, you can.
But at that time, this is probably like 2006, maybe. I was in Australia, and I have a really good friend that was living in Atlanta at that time. She's PK, son of a kid of a pastor, and she was just really burned out by church. A fellow Puerto Rican friend of mine. She was doing her master's in music in Georgia State, and then I was reading at that time Message Spirituality, and she was feeling really up and about herself, just really psychologically flogging herself and feeling like shit. And then I knew that at that point you guys were doing this thing at the Masquerade. I'm like, if you're cool with going into a bar, because it's a very different thing, but I felt like that's maybe what she needed to see and find out. So the story goes, I'm actually gonna have her next Monday.
Oh, cool.
She's a jazz, she's an amazing sax player. So she goes and she says, so I go and I sit there and I see people drinking and smoking. And then as the service is progressing, someone next to me offers me a smoke. I've never smoked in my life, never smoked in my life. And I smoked
Ha!
and I drank. And then she tells me, but Angel, it was probably one of the most spiritual experiences I ever had. It was very it really I even the other day I was talking to her and she was referencing it. She's like, I remember that time, that moment with such like I treasure that moment. And
Well,
I don't think
for
it's that ironic. I don't think it's that ironic.
no, I think for a lot of people, I mean, we're a lot of people we were reaching at the time were so hurt and torn apart by church that they didn't want to go into a church building. And then they came into a bar in a church setting, but we didn't do music or anything like that because we thought it was kind of triggering. But someone might need a drink to get through a church service, and people were like, "Well, what if someone's an alcoholic?" And I was like, "Well, I'm an alcoholic, and I don't drink, but I'm in a bar, so." And if someone can't handle it, then we'll help them find another church. But what we did in Atlanta was we became a part of the community. That's why the community said, "You need a space, we'll put you in a space to
Hmm.
meet." We were not a community. Revolution was not a community. Revolution was part of the community. And to me, that was some of the most, I wish I would have kind of realized that more when I was in it. But that was the important work that Revolution did there, was saying the church needs to be in the community, not a community. And so, to me, that was what was great, is because the community was reaching out and helping us, even though they weren't Christians. They probably thought Christianity was kind of shitty, but they saw what we were doing and said, this is something different. So we want to embrace them. So we were being brought in to the church. We were being embraced uh, by the world, by the community, because they respected our work, and because we were so transparent, honest about things. We did a whole like religion kills and all that kind of
Mm,
stuff.
the stickers and the belt
Yeah,
buckles, yeah.
and we had a sticker that said, "As Christians, we're sorry for being self-righteous bastards." And so we had this kind of like image of just trying to be like, "We're sorry." Hey, we get that religion is dangerous. That's not what we want. And I mean, we're probably going like, we want to just be Jesus-y, but and I see some errors in that type of thinking, but at the time it was what we needed to do, and people got it. People got it and said, okay, these guys are different. These guys are following Jesus. They're not following a church.
Hmm.
These guys have something different. They're not religion. They don't seem to be practicing. I mean, they're the least religious Christians we know. And so that's what we did, and we created that atmosphere.
Can you remember, looking back in the times that you were, since you guys started meeting at the Masquerade, what are some things that while you were in that time shifted that you can point back to, and maybe like one or two, three things that you can point back and say, these things happened while this was going on, and you can maybe, point to that context that it catered the opportunity for that evolution
Yeah.
to start happening.
Well, one is that we were become very apologetic to the community for the actions of the church.
Hmm.
The two is that's when people started asking me about gay rights and if being gay was a sin or not. And that started to really get on my radar. And so I started to study it. I'd actually got invited to speak at Exodus International, which was this ex-gay movement reparative therapy group, and I agreed to speak for them, but I wasn't really sure what they were. But I was like, yeah, I'm doing a lot of studying and researching on this myself, and I had a lot of gay and lesbian friends, but they kept asking me these questions like, "Are we welcomed at your church?" And I'm like, "Of course you're welcomed at my church, but like, are we seen as sinners?" And I was like, "Well, I've got to look at it, let me study it." And this is the strange thing is because I was much more of a literalist at the time. So my studies um, were like looking at Greek and Hebrew words and looking at the customs and like in Romans, like what is Paul confronting in Romans? Who is he talking to? What gods are they worshiping? Um, what community? What's happening? It was like priests sleeping with young boys, and that they could be givers but not receivers. I mean, it
Hmm.
was there was a certain fertility god that was being worshipped. Um, I've seen pictures of the statue of that god and realized that this is what Paul was talking about. Paul wasn't talking about being LGBTQ as we understand it at all. And so as I did that, and I was also talking to my friend Pastor Randy from Little Rock, Arkansas, sure has a open door community church, and Randy McCain, and talking to him about LG because he was a gay pastor and saying like, well, how do you make this happen? But also talking to Peggy Campolo and people like this, and realizing it wasn't in there biblically. So I made a decision at that time to come out as gay affirming, which meant I did not see it as a sin. I felt like people could celebrate their sexuality and believed it. So I went out to Arkansas and really just that's where I made my final decision that I was going to come out as a gay affirming pastor.
What happened while you were there that might have been maybe the last straw on the camel's back to embrace that position?
Well, I mean, I knew that it wasn't in the Bible the way that I had been told my whole life it was, and I think sitting down with someone like Peggy Campolo, but also just seeing the humanity of the people, seeing the pastor, seeing this church of people who are passionate about Christ, passionate about Christianity, um, and I couldn't see where the barrier was, and it just didn't make sense to me anymore. And it was like all of a sudden I was like, what have I been doing? Why haven't I been more communicating? Why haven't I been standing up for these brothers and sisters? And so when I came back from that trip, I told my board of directors that I would be announcing that I didn't think it was a sin to be gay, and it split them down the middle. It was really tough. Um, I said, well, this is the announcement I'm making. I made the announcement at the church at the bar, and we lost all of our support. I had to lay off my whole staff within a few weeks because all
So
of our
you
finances were gone and all my speaking engagements were canceled.
so there was like there was an organization that was supporting you guys financially.
Yeah. So I mean, so there was and people and
Mhm.
my work. I mean, I was speaking all over the country, all canceled.
Were you
Um,
naive? Were you naive about
no, I kind of
that?
knew. I knew it was going to happen. I counted the cost, but I knew what was right. And I, honestly, my parents put that within me. I remember going and talking to my mother, saying, "This is what I'm going to do," and she said, "Well, honey, I'm really worried about this. I don't know if you should do it." And I'm like, "Well, Mom, you and Dad built this thing in me that I should follow my my convictions." And and so I was like, what is it about that I shouldn't do it? She goes, "Well, I'm afraid the church is going to destroy you." She's like, "It's other Christians that are going to come after you if you say this publicly."
Like they did with them.
Yeah. And then I had an interview with Larry King a few days later where I announced it on Larry King. And things went crazy. I mean, even a pastor that worked with me was like, "How could you do this?" Other people were like, "Oh, congratulations. This is amazing. I can't believe you said this out loud and that you said it when nobody else is saying it." And I was just like, I followed my instincts, but it cost a lot, and it cost people I cared about a lot. I mean, not just me, but the churches that were connected to Revolution. There was a Revolution in Charlotte. There was, I was getting ready to move to New York to start Revolution out there, and so it kind of affected the Revolution that I was leaving behind in Atlanta. Um, it was really tough, so it cost me quite a bit. So I guess that was the most radical, the biggest theological shift that I
Hmm.
made that cost me something that had
Yeah.
like repercussions. I started working with Soul Force, which is a LGBTQ rights, Christian rights group, and doing work with them right away. And so yeah, so that was a
You
big
guys even
shift.
attempted to do some sort of tour. I don't know if it was in the summer that you guys went to churches like Lakewood with Joel Osteen. You guys were attempting. Can you
I've
briefly
yeah,
tell us a little bit about
I sat down and met with Joel Osteen. He wouldn't meet with any of our people, but he would meet with me one on one because he had respect for my family. It's kind of like organized crime or something. Um,
that?
and so he agreed to meet with me. And then he asked me about Sodom and Gomorrah. And I showed him the verse where it said that they were not destroyed for, they were destroyed for not showing hospitality to the stranger, which is really weird telling the biggest preacher in the United States what the Bible actually says. Um, I met with people
What
from
did he say to that? Did he say anything back to that?
no, I mean he seemed to want to be affirming.
Yeah.
He said, "I've tried to tell him that." He said that about the people who were with him, and they're like, "This church," and the people behind him said, "This church will never be affirming of
Yeah.
gay
Never
people."
digest that. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, all I can do is have a conversation, and that that was kind of based on nonviolence and LG. I mean, Martin Luther King's work, and so we did that. Um, yeah, so yeah, I mean, I met with people over in the Purpose Driven Church guy, his
Rick
church,
Warren. Rick
Rick
Warren.
Warren's
Yeah.
church, met with his staff,
TD
met
Jakes,
with,
I think also.
yeah, I wasn't at that meeting, but we did have a TD Jakes meeting.
Mm.
There was another one with Bill Hybels in Illinois,
Yeah. Yeah. There
and
was
that one,
a whole
yeah, it
thing
was
that
tough, but
unfolded
that
later
one
on.
went really well
Yeah.
because they stopped working with Exodus. They
Oh,
they they stopped. Yeah,
out of that
I
meeting,
mean that's what
perhaps.
Exodus said. Blamed us, and I was willing to take that blame. Um,
It's an accolade.
yeah. So
To
so so
deliver
that
that.
was all very interesting, and my theology is changing and changing and changing. I'm becoming more inclusive and more open to people, and
Just really quick note, at least in like in my experience, I always point to, I was kind of like visualize dominoes like lined up and one
yeah.
falling one after the other, and I point to the whole LGBT thing as that domino that began to knock many other dominoes alongside. I don't know if that might be a similar occurrence with you. That
It would
I feel that was a strong domino to fall, and then
it was
many others.
especially then, especially then.
Mhm.
I mean. it nearly ended my career. I mean, it nearly ended me being able to do what I do, and then deciding to move to New York, the most expensive place in the country. Um, but I did it, and I was glad I did it. Because honestly, I was having a harder time with Revolution Atlanta now because
What you
Christians
did.
weren't the
Yeah.
conservative or evangelical Christians who were still on that edge thought I had gone too far. Um, Pastor friends of mine thought I had gone too far, telling me that
What
God was against me. And
while you're in New York, I think, and what are you? While you're in New York, that's when I meet you. Things unfolded while you're in New York. Many. I know because I know of your story. Many, a number of things happened within your life that were definitely changing points while you're there.
that's where everything really gets to where we're at today.
So
This,
walk
I
us through
guess,
that a little bit. As much as
I
you feel
mean,
comfortable
I guess
sharing.
what, 2007,
6, 7, maybe.
8 now,
Yeah.
yeah, and I move out there. Um, my first marriage falls apart, and my mother passes away, and
Very close to each other,
you
right?
very yeah within a week. My mom had stage 4 cancer, and that was one of the odd things going through that is watching my mother be really sick and die from cancer, and having Christians more concerned about the fact that I was accepting gay people and loving, inclusion, having, they were more worried about my theology than the fact that my mother was
You're
dying.
suffering, your mom's dying,
And
yeah.
so that was another thing where it kind of went back to the time of like when my parents lost their ministry or when my dad was in prison, to see like this character flaw within a lot of people within the church of saying, your heart might be in the right place, but you're not doing it right. Well, I mean, I'm trying to think like they just were misguided.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're more worried about your theology than we are that your mom's dying. We're more worried about your theology than your parents being in prison.
Yeah, yeah, it's like
Whatever.
cussing. It's like cussing after you hammer your finger, and then they're more worried about the fact you cussed that your finger is like falling out of your hand.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
mean, like Tony Campolo used to have this sermon. He's like, millions
Yes.
of children are dying, going hungry, and it's bullshit. And the fact is, you're all more worried about the fact that I just said bullshit than millions of thousands of children dying.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, the church just majors and minors. And
I like that. Majors and minors.
yeah, and so that was a big thing. So when I moved to New York, I'm affirming, I'm opening up a church in a bar called Pete's Candy Store. My marriage has fallen apart. My mother's died. I meet a guy named Reverend Vince Anderson,
Yeah, I was gonna go into that, so you brought it organically. Go
and
ahead.
so who's an amazing musician. Um, he is like a mainstay in the Brooklyn scene. He does this stuff called Dirty Gospel. Just check him out if you can, if you're watching this. Right now, he's playing every night live on Instagram. So
On
on
Mondays he does.
Mondays.
Yeah.
So check that out if you can. But me and Vince became very good friends right away. And what
How did that
happens?
relationship affect you? Like the relationship with you and Reverend Vince?
Well, I mean, we were good buddies, and we just had good laughs. And he was such an amazing musician, and his music was very healing to me. And I wasn't one that was into any type of religious music, but his music was just enough. I mean, when I first saw him, I thought it was a joke, but his
Like a
music was,
satire.
yeah. I mean, it just got me through my divorce. It got me through my mom's death. His music was very healing. He used to play Just a Little Walk with Thee, and it really did something for my heart that Christian music had never done before. But at the same time, me and him started pastoring together. I brought him on as my co-pastor, and we would have talks about the resurrection a lot and different things, a lot of different theology things. And I was like, listen, if the resurrection wasn't literal, there's no way I'm going to be a pastor anymore.
Hmm.
And he's like, oh, it doesn't really bother me. And I was like, red flag. Um, but through our conversations and through our discussions, um, I was able to let go of the need for certainty in those things. Those things that I held so sacred for so long, and all of a sudden it was like God was bigger than that. But it took time. I mean, it took having a relationship. It took time to listen to his teaching when he would preach at Revolution. and hearing what he was saying and seeing a much deeper faith than even my own, because mine was all based on like this had to happen, this had to happen, this had to
The
happen.
certainty element, I
Yeah, and I
guess.
don't think people knew how rigid I was, because I was rigid, but I was very open. But you can be a literalist and be very progressive or very liberal theologically. I mean, I think the Bible is set up that way because it continues to be more and more inclusive as it goes on. You know, Jesus is inclusive, but then Paul becomes even more inclusive, and it just becomes this thing of like that happens over time. But then I started seeing like letting go of some of these sacred things, not saying that it didn't happen or it did happen, but being able to live within the tension and the mystery. And so that was really, really big for me. Um, so during this time, I meet a girl. I started dating this girl, um, and I go through a breakup. And what I realize is because of this second breakup is I never learned to focus on. I never dealt with my mother's death and my first divorce. And what happens is I meet Peter Rollins, and that's when everything just completely changes. I go to Pete Rollins. I'm suffering from depression. I'm going through a rough time. Pete's writing books in Connecticut. He has this house in Connecticut that he's living in. And I start going out there and staying with him because I'm just a wreck from the breakup and from just having to deal with all this stuff. And we start having theological conversations. And I start to realize how much doubt I have. And he starts exposing this doubt to me. And I'm wanting to know if he believes in a literal resurrection or this or that, you know. And he just starts just using his Jedi mind tricks with philosophy and theology, such I didn't realize what that stuff was. You know, he was just extremely educated and strips me down and pushes me off a cliff, basically. And I have a dark night of the soul. I just stopped believing. I mean, it was awful. I mean, it was horrendous, and at the same time, it was one of the most wonderful times of my life, um, because I came back to my faith in a different way, and that was just a little bit of just his effect on me. But I was able to embrace doubt in such a way and let go of the need for certainty because of our friendship and our relationship. And I still wasn't all there because I ended up just being more friends with Pete and kind of avoiding his. I didn't want to go any further into his pyrotheology or any of that stuff because it seemed so. It really shook my foundation. You know, a dark night of the soul is not fun. There is no nightlight in the dark night of the soul. You know, so I didn't want to go through that again. Um, but it brought me to this deeper understanding. I started reading people like Paul Tillich more regularly, John Caputo, and not that I necessarily agreed with them, but I liked what I was reading, you know, and Hegel and some of this, you know, just different little things. Like I would go buy little books that Pete would recommend, and I didn't understand what I was reading half the time. You know, like what is this, what are these people saying? You know, but I would underline it and I would put question marks and go back to Pete. And me and Pete would debate it, and I ended up writing my third book, Faith
Faith, doubt,
Faith
unknown.
Doubt. Yeah, so Faith Doubt one. And I ended up writing it at his place with my writer. And then Pete would kind of interject in it and we'd have all these really good conversations. And so it was just like this, it was just like I was just evolving so fast. Of,
When you think about these things, because you've authored, three books,
yep,
but the last two, I guess, they're more recent, and even then, I mean, it's been a while.
yeah,
When you look back to them, to start, unraveling and wrapping this conversation up, but when you look back to them, um, do you see that tangible change? Do you see how, not that you regret, but do you see that evolution?
yeah. No, I see an evolution because I also started to be like, go out to Belfast and be a part of seeing Pete's events and having these conversations. And to be honest with you, I met my next wife and now my ex-wife, um, in New York. we moved to Minnesota, me and Pete remained friends and worked together, and I did podcasts and things like this. And I just want to bring it up to the where we are now.
Sure, sure.
Um, so I had a complete dead about 5 years of nothing. Like I went from reading like 3 or 4 books a month to nothing,
Yeah.
and being in a kind of an unhappy place, but having kids and that being amazing. But then my marriage fell apart. My mental health fell apart. I had a nervous breakdown a couple, like 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago. Tried to take my life. All this stuff. Um, and me and Pete's friendship really played a huge part in that because Pete really believed in me when everybody else was telling me to give up. Pete kept saying, "Preach grace. Just keep preaching grace." And I'm like, how do I do that when I don't know what I believe anymore
Hmm.
and where the grace is coming from and all this? And I did something that I didn't think I would do is I started reading Pete's books. And I read The Divine Magician and I read Insurrection. I mean, I just finished Insurrection, but I also was reading uh, Todd McGowan's book, Life After Hegel. Um, just a lot of different books as I went through this, and it was through this brokenness, learning to become new person. All these different therapies that I went through really played a huge part of self acceptance. And all of a sudden, I started to accept me for who I was, no longer being afraid of confrontation with people on a personal level, and being happy with who I am and going, you know what? I'm not going to get a job because someone else thinks I need to get a job. I'm not going to quit the ministry and doing the work that I love because other people think I need to do that. I'm going to continue doing this work because there's something there. And what I realized, and I'd heard Pete talk about Jesus being abandoned on the cross and becoming an atheist on the cross and all this stuff a million times. I mean, I'd heard him speak about it, but I felt so abandoned by God through my divorce and through this mental breakdown that the only thing that kept me connected to Jesus, not even God, I don't even know what God is. I have no idea what God is. Maybe God's a ground of being. I don't know. I don't think God's a man in the sky or has a personality or so it's weird. But this abandonment of feeling empty, can you still hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Sí,
Okay.
señor.
This abandonment, all of a sudden, I felt a connection with Christ on the cross. And now, as I've been getting better, I've been able to accept resurrection a little bit more. But the idea with resurrection is you learn to live life well, but you still have the scars and the memories of the crucifixion. You
Mm.
don't ever let the crucifixion go. You don't ever let that, that moment is never gone. It is with you always. And I texted Pete the other day and said, "Listen, man, I'm I'm pyrotheology is my thing. I'm down." This was just a few days ago. So I mean, I'm really bringing you up to speed as much as I can. I mean, because only we have an hour, we can't go super super deep into it.
Yeah.
But the idea is that sometimes I believe in God, sometimes I don't. I never feel like I've arrived. I don't feel like I have God figured out, which for me has allowed God and to be something greater than my own understanding. Um, I don't care if you're an atheist or you're a conservative or you're a Democrat or progressive or anything like that. I don't even live in those worlds anymore.
Mm.
I feel like I'm living outside of that. I don't scapegoat people anymore because they believe one thing or think another. I want to communicate with people. I want to have conversations with people. I want to cause people to think through theology and philosophy. Um, and I just want to do the best work I can do. But it's taken me a long time and a lot of evolution of theology to get here. And I'm in a new place, where, I'm comfortable saying, I don't know. Do I have doubt? Of course I have doubts. Do I have hope? Yes. Do I have faith? I have that too. You know, I'm glad because I see a lot of my friends, maybe even like you, who are like, oh, I don't believe that stuff anymore. And I'm getting to be saying like, I just live in a place where it's alive and it's dead.
Of
It
course.
exists and it doesn't exist. I don't have to give it up and I don't have to accept it. I'm
Yeah.
in a place where there's something real here and I identify with it. And I'm going to create a place for people to share that with me and a space for us to go through that together. And so I don't feel like I have to make any, like, I denounce Christianity and I am now an atheist, or I'm an agnostic, or I'm this, you know what I mean? I'm Jay. I'm a pastor, I'm a speaker, and I love my work. And I do follow Christ. I do follow Paul, but I also follow Martin Luther King. I also follow Pete Rollins' work. I also follow, you know, different people's works, and I believe grace is still a powerful thing, and I believe Christianity is one of the greatest ways to communicate that. So I will continue to use the tools that I have to bring that forward.
Yeah.
And if we all die and get to heaven, I'll be shocked, but I'll be really happy about it. And then you can all buy me drinks and say, "Oh, hey, Jay, maybe you're right." Um,
There's
but
no
yeah,
drinks in heaven, Jay. Just so you
oh, no
know.
drinks in heaven. Oh, okay,
You're
dang.
gonna dehydrate.
Diet soda,
I
water.
think that that there's a lot of parallel. I mean, we definitely keep in touch, and I think a lot has to do with because there's a lot of parallel. There's a lot of parallel ground, and the parallel ground is that scapegoating is not sustainable.
No.
Scapegoating, it can give you it can give you a sense of heroism. It can give you a sense of you plant your flag, and scapegoating is very colonialist.
Yes, it's very colonialist.
You have to have that last word. You have to feel right about yourself, because that is the only consoling element you have, because you have not dealt with those demons inside you. So
Yeah.
then you have that as a illusionary comfort, like, I laid this person, I put that person in the right place, but it's all an illusion. So as you
Yeah.
start stripping those things down, and you realize, the Republican label, the Democrat label, the atheist label, the Buddhist label, I mean, sorry to sound redundant, but they're just labels, and that's fine. That they're not the problem. The
Yeah.
problem is how we use those labels, how we use them, and stuff
I
like
mean,
that.
yeah, there are people who suffer injustice based on political things, and I believe we should work towards, towards changing those things. But if you look how Martin Luther King Jr. changed things, he went and met with the politicians and he
Hmm.
had conversations with them. People would be like, "Would you ever pray for Trump? Would you be doing that?" Hell
Yeah,
yeah, I go. If he calls me, wants to sit down and have a chat, yeah, man,
yeah,
I'll have a chat. I'll say, listen, kids in cages. I mean, what is that all about? That's just not a human. That's injustice. That's going to scar these kids. In 20 years, we're going to have, you know, Mexican terrorists, because these kids are going to be lives are being torn apart.
got him.
You know what I mean? And they're not going to be terrorists. They're going to be freedom fighters.
Yeah, with every reason of being. I mean,
Yes.
the lasting effect is could definitely be. But what you say is there's definitely, and to close it out, I want to ask one more question, but I want to comment a little bit about that there's clearly a you know a tendency or a pattern that someone can take what you just said and take it out of context, like
Yeah,
sometimes
of
what they do with
course.
the things your dad says and stuff like that. Anyone can take a little thing and insert it in the right place, and then run with it. They'll say, "Oh, Jay is wants to lay hands with Trump," and that's completely missing the point there.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people that do meet Trump, but they're working for the empire. They're
Yeah.
working for some power driven nugget that they feel they're gonna inherit from that. There's a self interest. Last question I want to ask, and maybe it's like a last and a half, because I know you've mentioned in some of your talks something that if you were to author another book, and you're exploring into the themes of punk rock and the themes of anarchism and all that. Can you maybe share a little bit about that? Because I know that is kind of like that it's a commentary on that evolution and that study,
Well,
and how would that look like a little bit?
for me, punk theology would be based on things like kind of things like what Sex Pistols did, but then also what the Clash did. But then there's also a group from Belfast called Stiff Little Fingers, and they were stuck in the dualistic system that said you either are Protestant or Catholic, and you have to choose a side. Kind of like we are, you're either conservative or Republican. You have to
Hmm.
vote blue, or if you don't vote blue, then you're voting for Trump, and that's your only two choices. You know, and and the Stiff Little Fingers said, "The hell with that! I'm not choosing either side. I choose punk rock." And what I'm saying is, I don't choose either side. I choose grace. I choose my faith. I choose this Christianity that needs to be redefined. That word is so loaded, but we need to redefine the word, just like Slavoj Žižek is trying to redefine communism. You
Communism,
know,
yeah.
yeah, these words are important enough to stay, but they need to be redefined. And so what I'm saying is, I'm not going to live in this dualistic system anymore of good and bad. And there's one, these people are good and these people are bad. I believe we're all good and we're all bad. We're all contradictions and we all have all sorts of things going on. What I'm trying to do is say I can be within any scene and with any group and think for myself and have great conversations, and I'm not going to miss out on life and living life well by going through these different systems. So that is ultimately bucking up against the system. But I believe the concepts of grace is anarchy, because grace doesn't say, you know you're accepted if you do A, B, C, or D, or if you believe this one, or if you're, you know as long as you didn't kill anybody, then you can't get grace. No, grace is for everyone, and grace is just like freedom of speech. It protects those who you don't want. It's for those you don't want. It should make you uncomfortable. It should be an unstabilizing situation in our lives. The more we understand it, and it should cause us to want to work harder. And that's where I'm finding the errors. People rather be like, "Oh, Trump is like Hitler." It's like, no, that's dangerous talk. He has not killed millions of Jews in an oven. I do not like Donald Trump. I don't think he's a smart man. But this is the point is we've become lazy. And so a
Got
lazy
him.
thinking goes like, well, he's like this guy. He's like Hitler. It's like,
Yeah.
it's lazy thinking, but it's also dangerous thinking, because then you're saying, well, then anybody who follows him is like Nazis. And then it becomes more divisive, and then it becomes dangerous, and then it becomes violent. And then we start to hurt one another and tear one another apart. And we never become a community. We never sit down and communicate with one another. And even if we sit down and we communicate and we disagree, there's something amazing that happens just when the presence of people sit with one another. There's some sort of realization that we're still human beings. You might be an arrogant ass, and I might be a really, nice guy. But they're still recognizing each other. We're still recognizing each other's humanity. And
Got
so
him.
what I'm saying is we can't just sit online and be like, oh, this guy's bad or this guy's good. No, if we want to change the world, then we do it through mutual humanity. And
Yeah.
we are neither male nor female, nor Jew nor Gentile, nor slave nor free, nor Republican nor conservative, no, they're straight nor gay. We Christianity becomes an identity that says, I have no identity. I have no hierarchy structure. I give up both sides. I give up the hierarchy of suffering, and I give up my privilege, because he's
Got
saying,
him.
neither male nor female. So the female was no
Below.
privilege
Yeah.
below, and then you have the male who's the privilege, and it's saying, so we have suffering and privilege. Anything we both just go,
We get rid of that. We get rid of
yeah.
that illusion, that stigma. And last
But
last
that's hard
thing.
work, and nobody wants to
Oh
do that.
well, that's our hard work is sustainable work. That's the thing.
Yeah,
But we don't all get there at the same time. We all have to, and also that's something that I've been working through, like understanding everyone's process.
yeah,
Everyone's process is not my process, and that's where the grace element comes in. With the evolution, with like as I put in the flyer, with like an intrinsic point of life is evolution. I mean, it's just very is biological, is scientific, is integral to life, into survival, and not just literal survival, but mental sanity, keeping a good balance. Not It's kind of like a palm tree, in a hurricane. It has that flexibility. If it doesn't, if it was just rigid, it would just break down. So we kind of we should maybe emulate that palm tree element. Um, using theology as a maybe as an anecdote or as a reference point. Um, how can we tie philosophy and theology, um, other than with books, with our walks of life? How do our walks of life, how is our walking in life pertinent to how those shifts start happening. Because, and I asked that because a conception there is of philosophy or theology is that it's meant to be this block, this hard block stone that is unchangeable, and you're supposed to just stick your guns to it. And if you show any signs of change, then you're weak.
Yeah. That, but I know. I mean, philosophy changes. I think. I mean, grasping contradiction, which is a Hegel's concept of contradiction, which is something that's pretty new to me, has changed my life and how I see each other, and that's why I'm even more inclusive than I was before. Um, because now I want to sit down with my enemies. I want to love my enemies. I want to hang out with them, and I want to have conversations with them, and let them have a beer and me have a diet coke. Um, you know, that's how that works in life. Theology is. I mean, when I've sat in theology classes, and you've got 5 or 6 books of theology, and everybody's theology is completely different, and everyone spent their lifetime working on it. And so I like to dive into those ideas and take what I want and leave the rest behind. I'm going to do a little bit of cherry picking, but also seeing what makes sense. I mean, there are some theologies that I would love to follow just because they're like, oh, this is exactly what I want God to be. But I realize it just doesn't add up.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You just kind of have to use your own wisdom and understanding, and just continue to evolve. I mean, right now I think, oh yeah, my stuff's great, but if catch me in 5 years, it'll probably evolve to another level.
Which is what we're talking about here.
Right.
Amigo, un placer. It's been a pleasure
Yes. Thank
as
you, sir.
usual. Big hug from far away. Thank you to everyone that commented or engaged in this conversation from beginning to finish, or those who passed by and whatnot.
Hmm.
Those comments are available, Jay. You know, you can
Yeah,
definitely
I'm gonna
come back.
definitely. No, I'm gonna come back and look at them.
Yeah, same thing with me, man. Thank you so much, man.
All right. Thank you.
Bon appetit. Enjoy your evening,
Thank you, sir.
and until we see each other again.
Amen.
Much
Bye.
peace, amigo.
Adios. Bye
Adios, amigo.
bye.
Well, people, thanks so much for tuning in. Tertuliando en Cuarentena. It was a great conversation. I really enjoy these things. I enjoy them for myself, and hopefully you guys enjoy them as much as I do. Tomorrow we'll go back to Spanish again. So my Spanish audience, you're welcome back, and my English audience too. If you want to work on your Spanish, so we're gonna have Nore Feliciano, who's a singer-songwriter from Puerto Rico. All right, guys. So, like our good old Walter Mercado used to say, much peace and love. Mucha paz y amor. Until next time. Adios.